All right, everybody. Today we're going to review genetics. Now, we're going to start here with something we already know. We already know that there is DNA within the cells, and that DNA is curled up into something we call chromosomes. Now, we haven't talked a lot about chromosome structure and what it does, but we're going to start that today. But we're going to do it in the context of what we're going to call classical genetics. And classical genetics can be complicated in the sense it has a lot of terms. And what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try to explain those terms in a way that relates back to what we've already learned. And what have we already learned? Well, it's all on this picture. We know that there are pieces of DNA that we call genes, all right? And those genes carry information. They carry the information for making proteins. And we've already learned that proteins do all of the work in the cell, or at least most of it. They do things such as, let's say, they change shape, and in a muscle cell, that might act to allow the muscle to also change shape. So when the proteins, which are all connected to one another, change their shape, then the muscle cell changes its shape, and therefore you may move your arm or blink your eyes. All right, now that is a physical change, all right, but also, or physical work, I should say, but proteins also do chemical work. They may act to break down your food. So these are the actions that your cells take, like movement or creating chemicals, or chemical reactions that assist your body to perform all its functions, like walk around or digest food. So the proteins do all of the work, whether it's chemical or physical. And the information needed to make these proteins are in the genes, which are in the DNA. And we've learned that the DNA is located in the chromosomes, all right? The DNA gets all wound up here into a chromosome, and that is located in the nucleus within the cell. So we've learned about cells, we've learned all the parts, we've learned that there's a nucleus, and we've learned that there's DNA in there in the form of chromosomes. And we've also learned that on that DNA are genes, pieces of DNA that carry information that allow you to make your proteins, which allow you to, your cells anyhow, to perform work and ultimately for you to live. This is very important. Now, this is all a review. Now we're going to go into something new, which we're going to call genetics. And specifically, I'm going to call it classical genetics. And classical kind of means like old, right? Or it happened first, something like that. And that's exactly what's going on here. Classical genetics, it was discovered before we knew about DNA. We knew about cells, but we didn't know much about what was going on inside. We didn't know about DNA. We didn't really know what the proteins did. But someone by the name of Gregor Mendel, he figured out that there must be something inside organisms that is transmitted from one generation to the other. Now, what he didn't realize was that what was being transmitted from one organism, from one generation to the other, was the DNA. And the DNA was controlling essentially the traits. That's a term we'll need to learn here. But traits are like your eye color or your height. It could be the color of your eyes, something like that. These are your traits, and your traits are transmitted through the genes, okay? So we've learned what genes are, and now we're gonna kind of look at this thing called classical genetics, which kind of explains how things are transmitted across generations, but without talking about DNA at all. But I'm going to kind of give you a gentle nudge towards classical genetics and all the terminology in classical genetics given what we already know. So keep in mind, this is a gene, all right? It's just a piece of DNA that's on one of the chromosomes here. And that DNA, that little piece I'm talking about, is going to be something that carries information for making a protein. So moving on here, we move on to a gene, all right? We already know that it, and we just talked about eye color. All right, eye color, there's a gene for that. Actually, there are many genes for that. Or we might have down here hair color, and there are many genes for that as well. It's not really just one gene, but the idea is there is a piece of DNA that determines your eye color. Actually, what it's doing is it's making a protein, and that protein is what we call a pigment. And that's what gives your eyes, your hair, your skin, that's what gives them their color. And so this gene codes for this protein, and therefore it shows up in your eyes as, say here, brown eyes. Now down here, there's another gene, all right? Now, this gene determines your hair color. Hazel, I don't know if there's someone with hazel hair, but okay. Hazel is kind of cross between brown and green, so I think this is rather funny, actually. So hair color gene, and it determines here. Now, what you need to notice is they have this chromosome, this drawing of a chromosome over here, and it shows you the band here and a band here, and it's indicating that that's where your gene is located. And yes, when we look at a chromosome, we can figure out that there is a place where we typically find the hair color gene here, or the eye color gene, and we call that a loci or a loci. Now, the loci or loci, they're going to be pretty much in the same spot for every person. That does not mean the gene, the DNA, is exactly the same. So keep in mind, as we go through this, that yes, on the chromosome, which is just a bunch of DNA all wound up, there is going to be a place where we typically find the eye color gene. And there is a place on the chromosome here, at least this particular chromosome, where we're going to find the hair color gene. Now, we know that there are multiple chromosomes. Now, the thing is, your chromosomes come in pairs, though. So you have more than one copy of these. All right, so keep in mind while we're going through this, that yes, each chromosome has loci or loci on it, all right, but you have two pair of each type. And what that means is each pair are going to have these genes on that particular chromosome, all right? So say it's chromosome 1. Chromosome 1 is very large, has lots of genes on it. And chromosome 1, you're going to have two of those. So there are going to be two that have this particular loci and this particular loci. That does not, however, mean that you have the exact same DNA in those places. You get each of these chromosomes from one parent. So you may have gotten, say, the brown colored gene on the chromosome 1 that you got from mom. Maybe it's a different color from the one you got from dad. That's going to control what your eye color is. It's not going to be exactly like mom's, not exactly like dad's. It's going to probably be something in between. Or there is a case where we have this situation where a gene dominates another gene. Now, that's going to be another discussion for later, but keep in mind that you are going to have two copies of each gene, all right, because you have two copies of each type of chromosome. All right, so this particular chromosome, you'll have two copies, and this one has two loci here we see. So you're going to have this one, and then you're going to have another chromosome that's about the same size, and it's going to have the same loci or loci, all right, that are going to have these genes at these particular spots. So here, let's blow that up a little so you can see here. And so the location, the loci, the idea here is when you have more than one, it's plural, it's locus. So this is the gene locus, all right? And the gene, each gene, now notice they're putting them different colors. They're in the same spot. They're the same chromosome. That's what this term means. So we have a new term here, homologous chromosomes. Homologous means it's the same chromosome, but they're not exactly different. Homologous chromosomes have the same loci, locus, however you want to see it. I guess loci is the plural and locus is the singular one. But this is a gene locus. It's a little confusing there. I will accept either term. Don't worry about it. Just as long as you use the term locus or loci. But the idea here is that at this place, the locus, you're going to find this particular gene. The gene is not going to be necessarily identical. In fact, it probably never is. So it's always, everybody has a few mutations in their genes. They're not always, they're almost never exactly the same. All right. So, but they may function the same. So realize just because you do change the DNA doesn't always mean that the protein changes. But if the protein does change, then the protein may have different abilities. And if it has different abilities that show up, then we say that you have a different trait. So we're going to get to that, but just realize the proteins are what actually produce you. And the information for producing those proteins are here. So you have two copies of this gene. So you're making two different proteins here, and the combination of those two are going to determine how your cells behave. And then ultimately that's going to control how you behave. All right, so homologous chromosomes mean that they have the same loci. That means they have the same genes at the same spots. Now, when you have two different ones, all right, so this is the red gene and this is the blue gene. Actually, we shouldn't call it a gene. These genes are the same gene. They make the same protein. They don't make them exactly the same, though. Instead, we call them alleles. Alleles just means that, okay, it's the same gene, it makes the same protein, but they're not absolutely identical. So maybe the red one gives you red hair, the blue one gives you blue hair. And so you have two alleles, same gene, it's a gene that creates the pigment in your hair, but it gives you different colored hair. So maybe with this, you get a blending of red and blue hair. That would be really interesting. I don't know anybody with blue hair, at least not that it's natural, but if there were such a thing, then you would get a blending. You would get a little red and a little blue in your hair. And that's because you have two different alleles. You have a gene that has a slightly different version on each chromosome. So you have two chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. This one from, say, dad was red. This one from mom was blue. So therefore, you get one red and one blue that will end up making little proteins, all right, that are going to alter your hair color a little bit like dad and a little bit like mom. All right, so alleles. Alleles, just keep in mind the terms here. Locus, alleles. Alleles are different types of, different versions, it's a better word. Alleles are different versions of the same gene. Homologous means that, well, the genes are there at this particular locus, they're the same gene, but you might have slightly different versions of that gene at each locus. All right, so going on to the next one. Here, let's shrink that down a little. Oops, wrong way. I gotta go way down. Oh, too much. There we go. All right, so this is going through what I just said, only it's a better diagram, I suppose. Now, in a pair of homologous chromosomes, homologous means that you're gonna have the same genes at the same spots, same loci or the same locuses. No, you'd never say locuses, you'd say loci. So the same loci, you have the same genes. You have the R gene, the P gene, the A gene, the B gene, and the C gene. Now, what I want you to notice, this is a little c and this is a big C. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So this is a pair. So it's chromosome 1, 2, 3. Doesn't matter which chromosome it is. Now it says paternal and maternal. So they're homologous chromosomes. And so that's why they call it a homologue. And a homologue, the paternal one means dad. All right, maternal, that's moms. So maternal is your mother, paternal is the father. So these are the two chromosomes you got from each parent. So dad had a little R, a big P, a big A, a little B, and a little C for his genes on this particular chromosome. Mom had a little R, a big P, a big A, a little B, but she had a big C. All right, so she has slightly different allele. All right, so the gene is here. These are the same gene, but they are different alleles. So this is the idea. Each genetic locus, an individual has two alleles. You have big P and big P here. All right, one each on each homologous chromosome. So I think this diagram is a pretty good one. It kind of explains everything. This is the locus. This is the locus of a particular gene on a chromosome. All right, but it doesn't mean that they have to be identical. Like in this case down here, if you see down here, the little c and the big C, all right, they are different. All right, now we have to have a terminology. You always have to have a new term to describe what you're talking about. All right, whenever you have big letters, all right, we're going to call that dominant. And whenever you have little letters, we're going to call that recessive. So if I have two big A's right here, we say that is homozygous dominant. Homozygous, homo means the same. So what it means is we have two of the same letters, big A, and dominant means the larger letters. So if I say homozygous dominant, you don't necessarily know the letter, but you know that you have the same letters, as in they're both big, and I should say they're the same letter, that's homozygous, and dominant means they're capitals. All right, so dominant is going to represent capitals. Now what dominant means here is that wherever you have a big letter, it will always cover up or mask the little letter. In other words, if it was a hair color, a big A is like brown hair and a little a would be blonde. And if you get a big A and a little a, well, that means this one is dominant. The brown hair, the big A, is going to cover up the blonde hair and you end up with brown hair. All right, that means the only way to have blonde hair would be to have two little a's. All right, and that's going to be the case here. So little b, it's homozygous. That means same letter. And recessive. Recessive means little letter. So homozygous recessive means two little letters. And that's what little b. All right, two little letters. All right, homozygous meaning the same. So here, if this were blonde hair, you would have blonde hair. All right, if capital B were brown hair, then if you had either of these were a big B, then you'd end up with brown hair, not blonde. Even though you had a little b, the big B would cover it up. And you would end up with, now there are cases where it's blended. All right, so blended, in other words, if you get two different letters, some genes, when they interact, some alleles, I should say alleles, when two alleles interact, all right, they blend instead of having one just dominate and cover up the other one. And that case would happen if you are heterozygous. So heterozygous, notice you don't have dominant or recessive. Heterozygous is when you have a big and a little. So you have one dominant gene and one recessive genes, one big letter, one small letter. And that's what we see here, big C, little c. Now, if big C is dominant over little c, you will only see whatever the trait that comes with big C is. So let's say this is a gene for foot size, all right? Big feet and little feet. And let's say it's dominant. If it's dominant, then you only get this. You would have big feet, not little feet, all right? This is just covered up. But let's say it's blended. All right, and if these are blended together, then maybe you have medium feet if you have this. It all depends if this is a dominant trait or not. If it's a dominant trait, then you only get what the big letter says. If it's blended, then you kind of mix the two. So big feet and little feet, if it's blended, you have in-between feet, middle-sized feet. If, however, it's a dominant trait and the big C covers up the little c, then you're going to have big feet. The only way to have little feet would be to have two little c's And that would give you little feet. And that would be the only way to have little feet. All right, now we're going to move on to the next one. All right, here we're going to see a lot more about the chromosome. All right, now chromosome terminology. Now, we call them homologous, but when they come together to duplicate, we call them sister chromatids. Whenever you duplicate, you have a single chromosome and you duplicate it. Now, homologous is when they're not identical. Sister chromatids are identical. In other words, and you get an identical one whenever your cells are about to divide. So when your cells are about to divide, basically you'll make an identical copy. And what will happen is then these will split apart and one will go into the new cell and one will stay behind in the original cell. So realize you do duplicate your chromosomes, but that other, if you remember, we have another chromosome here. All right, this one. Well, this one would also duplicate itself, just like this. So you're going to end up with 4 here. Let's see, I jumped ahead and I really shouldn't have, but that is what we're going to show. So this is just for a single chromosome. This is for, say, the one you got from mom. And mom's chromosome, you duplicate it, but you're also going to be duplicating the one for dad. And those are going to be sent off to new cells, whereas the original will stay. All right, now here, this is kind of where we're going with this. All right, so, well, this is going back, sorry, I was jumping ahead. This is going back over those terms for homozygous and heterozygous. So we've kind of already covered this, but we have 2 chromosomes and we have basically 2 big B's and 2 little b's. Here we have the heterozygous case where you have a big B and a little b, or a little b and a big B. They're just showing you can reverse these and it doesn't matter. But if you have 2 of the same letter, all right, on your 2 chromosomes, you're homozygous. If the 2 letters are different, it doesn't matter the order, you are heterozygous. All right, they're just going back over this. Now, I do want to point out that here, if you'll see, they have this term down here called wild type. Wild type allele is the most common one. That's the one that is, if you look through the population and essentially the allele, the big B or little b, that is the most common out there. That's what we really call a wild type. All right, that's the most common. But a mutant allele is going to be the one that has changed, that's different from the most common one. So keep that in mind. Anything else of interest here? No, I think we're good. Let's go on to the next one. All right, now here's where we begin to start talking about how classical genetics works when you kind of put it together. Now, we already said that an allele is an alternate form of a gene occurring at a specific locus on a chromosome. So this here is probably something you need to, well, memorize, but understand it. Don't just memorize it first, but then you need to work on understanding it. And to do that, you probably need to work some problems. We're going to be doing some problems that have to do with determining what the children will be like from 2 given parents. So different parents have different genes on their chromosomes, different alleles on their chromosomes, and they're going to mix and match. And so you're going to get different combinations. So of course the children are all different. Now, how do we kind of do this? We do something called crosses, and we'll be doing those in worksheets. But at this point, we need to make sure we get all of the terminology, I guess is the right word for it, down. So, and also the functions. So realize here that each parent donates 1 allele, all right, from each, for every gene. Now, they may be different. It might be a big B or a little b, say, but they're going to at least give 1 to the child. Now, homozygous, all right, that's when 2 alleles are the same. So both parents were big B maybe, and you got 2 big Bs, so you are homozygous. Heterozygous, if it happens if you have two different alleles, a big B and a little b, for instance. All right, that would be heterozygous. Now, homozygous alleles are identical to each other. So here we have wrinkled and round. Now, this is from peas. I told you about that guy named Gregor Mendel who discovered this, or I mentioned him earlier, and he studied peas. And there are two different types of peas. There's wrinkled and round peas. And he started breeding them, and he worked out all of the rules for genetics that we're going to be learning from just breeding peas on his own in his spare time. So here's homozygous alleles and heterozygous alleles. And what it means is if you have the wrinkled gene, all right, and you have two copies of it, you're homozygous and you're going to be wrinkled. There's no other option. Now, the heterozygous allele, you have wrinkled and round. So which are you going to be? Well, we don't know because we don't know enough about how these two interact. It could be that wrinkled, all right, completely dominates round, and this organism would be wrinkled. However, it may be that these two interact, all right, and you get something that's not quite round and not quite wrinkled. We don't know yet. However, one thing we do know is that this one is not round, and we also know this one is not round, because if they're round, all right, and I'm assuming that wrinkled is dominant. We know that if wrinkled is dominant, then it might be wrinkled or it might be some combination of wrinkled and round, but we do know that it's not going to be round if round is the recessive trait. So there's dominant traits, recessive traits, and you have to learn that on each trait. You have to know, okay, we're talking about the shape of peas here, and the shape of peas, there's a gene that controls that. And there will be different alleles. There'll be like a wrinkled allele and a round allele. And depending on the combination you get, will determine the nature of the peas. They'll either be wrinkled, round, or some combination, some mixture. We don't know unless we know more about those traits. All right, I think we're done here. We'll be doing worksheets on this. All right, so you'll have these worksheets, and I'll have another video showing you exactly how to work out what the children will be given the genetics, the alleles that the parents have.